Join our knowledgeable hosts as they dive into the captivating universe of comic books, movies, TV shows, and pop culture. Get ready for vibrant discussions and a shared enthusiasm for all things superhero and beyond. A comic podcast straight from the panels. This is Beyond the Capes.
All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode of Beyond the Cape. With us today, Melissa F. Olson. We are here to talk about the upcoming work for Archaic. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
We're excited to talk about it. Now, going through your work, and when I did get the email for this, I was pretty excited. I love cryptology. I love cryptozoology.
Okay.
You had done a previous book, Project Cryptid, and then as we'll talk about the book here, there's obviously a lot, to me, there's a lot of cryptozoology kind of built into it.
Yeah.
Always been a fan?
Not the way that you mean, but also yes, always. It's, I started writing fiction and I started out with urban fantasy, which is generally vampires and werewolves, the classics.
Of course.
But I've always enjoyed kind of slipping in as much real folklore and mythology as I can, even kind of within the parameters of urban fantasy. So the Project Cryptid story that I did was about the Hodag, which is a super regional cryptid local to northern Wisconsin, where I'm originally from. So if you, like me, grew up in northwestern Wisconsin, you probably had a high school football team that played against the Rhinelander Hodags. And if you live anywhere else, you'll probably have never heard of it. So I love real mythology and legends and incorporating that stuff in wherever I can. Obviously, Archaic has just been my chance to kind of go crazy with it.
Perfect. And I do know that being on the suburbs of Chicago in the Northwestern Territory,
Yep.
Very familiar with that.
Mm-hmm.
Especially the story. I always love when there's a setting in Chicago at any chance. Underutilized city by far.
So have you gotten a chance to read the first issue?
I have.
Did you see the Drake Hotel?
I did.
Okay, good.
Hotel.
So Sally, my artist, is from New Jersey. So she doesn't know Chicago landmarks at all. But in my mind, because I'm in Madison or the Madison area, so Chicago is not that far. I was in Chicago last weekend and last month. So it's a perfectly reasonable day trip. And the Drake Hotel always sticks out to me because of the movie Mission Impossible. John Voight has to mention the Drake Hotel like 3 times. So when I was coming up with a fancy location in Chicago where there would be, a fancy event to cater, my mind went there immediately. And then I had to find pictures for Sally, but I realized the first images that I sent her of the Drake Hotel were the wrong time of year, because the book is set during the winter. So there's this big contrast between cold, snowy, wet Chicago and this magical island that is tropical if you want it to be, or whatever weather you want. So I had to find her a picture of the Drake Hotel where it was winter and the trees were all dead looking and gnarly. And it is not at all what the Drake Hotel prefers to put on their website, let me tell you.
Yeah. Yes, for anyone listening that's never been to Chicago, it's always insane that I have to explain that in the winter. Like, man, I hope they set the tracks on fire enough so we can get the ice off. And it's the craziest image you'll ever see in your mind is people are just burning the tracks.
Yeah. I mean,
just a normal Chicago thing.
Just a normal thing. No problem.
Now, as you mentioned before, you've done a lot of writing. How did you come about finally getting into the comic book world?
Well, I hadn't really intended to, but for me, it was the pandemic. I had always gone and traveled to conventions as part of promoting my books. And I would make friends or writing acquaintances at conventions because writers are a weird bunch. 99.9% of our time is alone in a room with laptop and yoga pants and dog. And like, that's my job. So when we meet each other at a con for one weekend a year, it's like putting on a different personality and remembering how to do friend. Uh, and so I had made friends with some comic book writers that way. And during the pandemic, a group of them did like weekly chats for writers, or, this group of
Yeah.
people who had been collected at various cons. And at the time I was going through a divorce, it was dark days. And so this was really like, one of the things that just kept me going during lockdown. And so I came up with this idea that was sort of related to things I was thinking about during lockdown and the pandemic. And I'm like, gosh, this one feels visual. Like, this one feels really like something I want to look at, not just describe. I've always felt my weakest quality as a writer is descriptions because I find them boring to write. And so I'm always like making myself describe the thing. And I wanted to see it. I wanted to see it really bad. And so I took it to a friend of mine, Paul Cornell, who's also in comics. And I was like, hey man, I've got this idea. I think it could be a comic, but I don't know. And he's like, oh, yes, you'll write it as a comic and I'll help you. He really likes when I do his accent, by the way. He definitely thinks it's a perfect spot on impression and has no notes for me.
Oh, perfect. There you go. Um, Now, what was it like? And we've had a couple of writers on the show. The hardest part about converting writing books into a comic book is the amount of condensing. We're writing a 200-page story to now saying, here's 22 pages, but you're getting about 4 panels per 2 pages. Condense the story down.
Yeah.
Was that a challenge?
It definitely was, but I will say I originally came from film and television. That's where my education is. I went to school for film out in LA, and I worked in the studios for a minute after graduation. So I'd had a little bit of experience with screenplays, which is very similar in the like condense, pare down, pare down, pare down. I'm also from the writing school of if this sentence doesn't do anything, gank it. Like there shouldn't be a single word in your book that doesn't need to be there. So I'd had some experience with that. The harder thing for me was that my writing had always been a direct conversation between from me to a reader. And the
Yeah.
trick was to try to make them forget I was there, right? Something, usual suspects, greatest trick the devil ever did, joke. So I was always talking right to the audience. When you write a comic script, you're not talking to the audience, you're talking to an artist. And you have to figure out how to do that in a way where they see the same or close to the same thing in their head as you see in your head. And but you have to be careful not to be like, here's how to do your job. And
Yes.
I was really, really lucky to get Sally. She was so patient with me, and I'm sure like I'm afraid to look at our early emails and read those early drafts that I sent her because I'm sure I did not figure out how to communicate well. But it was figuring out how to describe a panel, like what I wanted to see in the panel in a way where Sally would get what I was going for, not be insulted, and also add her like artist magic to it, which is the part I can't do. In I got to tell you, it is still. I mean, I've written 5 issues. We're doing edits on the fourth issue right now, and it still hasn't gotten old that there is a person drawing the inside of my brain, like a professional paid artist has a job where she draws the inside of my brain. That's crazy to me still.
Exactly. And you're not alone to say it. What was it? One of our screenwriters who went to comic books said it's a tango of giving them just enough, but not too much, and letting them go crazy with it, and not worrying about kind of the final result to a degree,
Yeah.
and giving someone that control.
And
That's
I'm sure if you had asked me, before I started all this, I would have said, "Oh, writers must try to work with as many different artists as they can." But I understand more and more why people work together multiple times. Because everybody talks about the shorthand that you kind of get into. And with Sally, like it wasn't so much that I just instantly figured out how to write perfectly in my panel description. It was more that she really got used to me, like the garbled way that I explain what I want. And we also really found a level where, I would say, please draw this. And she would draw something that was a little different. And I could recognize when it was better, when her thing that didn't quite match my head was better, which is probably 92% of the time. That 8%, I had really good ideas.
there
But
you go.
92% of the time, Sally's is better.
All right, we'll give them a little bit of credit.
Yeah.
Um, I guess that's the biggest thing too, coming from book writing to this, is being kind of a solo adventurer, and now you kind of have someone that you built this world with. So it's no longer like you just writing your own story. You now have kind of a team that you formed, and both you
Yeah.
and the artist, I feel like you guys get invested as you should be. I mean, that's the whole point. You wouldn't be doing this if you weren't. What's it like finally kind of having a team behind you now, where it's not necessarily just your story, even though you're the creating force behind it, but now you have
Oh, yeah,
a whole
absolutely.
bunch of people behind you.
If I had all the money in the world, like just as a fun experiment, I would hire like 5 other artists to draw like page 1. Just to see, like just because I think it's so incredible how when you take my ideas and then you give them to an artist and what you get is so specific and so in line with what Sally want of what Sally how she thinks and how she sees it. Um in terms of the team sport thing, you know, it was very tricky at first, because you're exactly right. I kinda went into novels so that I could do my own thing and nobody could tell me what to do. I worked in Hollywood for a bit, and Hollywood is very much art by committee, and it's often the committee is way too big and has the wrong priorities and too much or too little money, and you get messes a lot with Hollywood. And I had kind of left that and started writing novels where I control everything. I mean, I am the master puppeteer of every novel world. A publisher and a reader, they can choose to buy the book or not buy the book, but I make the book I want to make. So it was different. I was expecting to if I'm being honest, I kinda was expecting to hate it. Like, I thought, "I'm too much of a control freak. This is gonna be terrible. This is gonna be so hard." But it ended up being kind of a relief
Exactly.
because coming into a different format where the pacing of the story works differently, and having 5 issues, it's you wanna tell one arc over 5 issues, but it's also each one has to kinda have a beginning, middle, end, and have its own little episode. And so Sally would find these ways to sort of gently nudge the story, or she would draw something that was so much not right because she followed my script exactly. And then I'd be like, "Oh, that's the problem. I'm sorry, now you have to do it all over again." But, it was just more of like a safety net to be working with somebody Sally and our editor, Sarah Litt, who were more experienced than me, but really open to, like, doing this with me and kind of, taking my hand and chaperoning me through this. So it ended up being a, like, huge relief. If
Definitely.
you're going to switch careers mid-career, I highly recommend taking Sally and having her teach you how to do it. Whatever the career is, I'm sure she'll be fine.
Yeah, she'll figure it out. It's
Yeah,
fine.
she'll figure it out. It's great.
Perfect. Now, is there anything in making these comic books that you feel you could bring back to novel writing if you were to write a book after this arc?
Ooh, that's a great question. I love that. Um, so the books that I've written have tended to be very urban fantasy. So they're very much like one character's voice. Most of my books, not all, but most of them are first person. And that makes the scope very limited because you can only know what this one character knows. You're only in the one head. You have one pair of eyes. You only get to see that. Archaic ended up being much more of a ensemble, but the ensemble is a family. I really grew up on Steven Spielberg, the big adventure action movies, The Mummy, Jurassic Park, those sort of PG-13, let's try and keep the group together, the found family together. And Archaic let me write a family in a way that I hadn't really gotten to do before. And to write multiple characters and follow different characters. I can follow the main character is probably Tess, the single mom, but I can write Audrey going down the hall and encountering this crazy creature, her 9-year-old daughter. Or I can write what the villain is doing. I've never been able to write, hey, let's go check out what the villain's up to, just on their own, in their own spot, and see what they're doing. So it's been fun to get to do that kind of thing and to tell the story in a way where I'm not just looking through one pair of eyes, but I'm looking at a whole group and a whole island.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. And I think a lot of people bring a lot of that aspect is learning how to write. I mean, world building, but character building and trying to tell different stories, especially villain background, which I was going to ask you. Obviously, you have to write the bad side. You have to write kind of the bad side so you can bring it together. You give conflict, just like a novel. Do you ever think you, after kind of experiencing some of this, would go and write a novel or comic book solely from a villain perspective, where the good side was more of the side?
That's an interesting question, and it is very kind of hot right now to do the supervillain thing. My daughter is reading John Scalzi's Starter Villain like on a loop right now, and I'm trying not to worry about that. I'm sure that'll not come back to bite me in the ass in any parenting way. But if I'm being honest, I'm a Luke Skywalker guy. I'm not a Darth Vader guy. I love the hero. I love writing the hero. I will say though, most villains think they are the hero. When I was writing an urban fantasy and I'd write a long series, my first book when I was starting out, the villain is like a classic, like serial killer that wants to do murder kind of villain, just your classic evildoer. But the more I would write, and I think there were 15 or 16 books in that series, if you count, novellas and all the short stories and things. I knew my main character so well. I knew her voice, I knew her reaction, her sense of humor. When I would start a new book, I would sit down and I would begin with the villain, because that was who I had to put up against my guy. And my job was always to knock Scarlett down, my lead character. My job was to knock her down and find an interesting new way for her to pick herself up. But it wasn't going to entertain anybody if she just faced like a serial killer in every book, or someone with boring motives in every book. So I love villains and I love writing villains because to me, like that is half your story. You need half of your story to be the bad guy and their plan, and it has to make sense, and it has to be in conversation with the good guy. But I probably wouldn't write like from the perspective of the villain or in celebration of the villain, because I'm a Luke Skywalker guy.
Everyone loves the hero's journey, and it's funny you say that too, because everyone's the hero in their own story. And I think every vampire story you look at it, the townspeople can't believe they're killing people, but a vampire, he's just trying to survive. He's gonna take down what he has to take down, and it's not really him doing it for fun, it's him sustaining. So yeah, everyone is always the hero in their own story.
My partner is a RPG writer. So I write novels and now comics, and he writes for Pathfinder for Paizo. And he does this bit and I love monster movies. And that can be like the Lake Placid, like the creature feature that's semi-realistic, all the way up to like Godzilla King of the Monsters. Like, I love monster movies. My partner Brian does this very annoying, very funny thing where we'll be watching one of these movies and I'll be like, in it, and I'm like super involved and I'm right there. And then, some alligator will like rip a human being in half, and the music gets all scary and intense. And Brian will say in this like quiet little voice, he's just trying to feed his family.
That's it.
And he does this like, the thing is, he's very good at finding like the one moment when I'm not expecting that and making me spit something, that I was drinking out. So yeah, you're right. The villain, like, nobody sees themselves as the villain. Very few do, and they're not really that interesting. Like, if you're like, yes, I want to rule the world with evil. But even, there's creatures that are really just trying to eat, and there's bad guys who think that they are in some way getting what they're owed.
Exactly.
And I like writing all of that. The villains in Archaic, I think one of the questions that the book sort of raises is about Ereshkigal, who is the Mesopotamian goddess of the dead. And when the family arrive, the human family from Chicago, they arrive on this magical island, and there's shenanigans afoot, and they immediately assume it's gotta be the goddess of death, right? Like, who else would be up to mischief on this island except the goddess of death? So that becomes kind of a conversation that the comic has, is what is the purpose of a goddess who is no longer with any of her worshipers? What function does she play on this island? And how much agency does she have to get to do her own stuff? So I did get to kind of play with whether or not someone is a villain just based on like how they're made and what they do.
Well, that brings us to the whole reason we're here, is to discuss Archaic, which
Yeah.
was very fun to read. The artwork, as you said, obviously you could tell you guys put a lot of work into it. It translated really well. My only issue was how issue 1 ended. Right when I feel like a question was going to get answered, just right there. That would be the only thing that really took me by surprise. I was like, oh, we ended it right here.
Mhm. Yep, nope, and
Great.
I should say, so the book is about a magical island. And full disclosure, issue 1 doesn't spend very much time on that island. And that was a tough call. And to be honest, it was probably something that has a lot to do with me being a novelist. Because you're right, comics is efficiency in each panel, maximum storytelling per panel. But the tradition that I come from, I have to set stakes in order to really like dig into a story. So the book is about this sentient island. Her name is Demond. She's a control freak. She has a lot of ideas and she can do anything she wants. And the island's sort of the responsibility for taking care of it is inherited by this woman who's a single mom in Chicago who's really struggling. And the question that I spend the first issue really setting up is, why doesn't she just leave? So I'm a single mom when I was writing it. I have a partner now, but when I was writing this, I was a newly single mom. And the idea of bringing my kids to an island that's, filled with questionable creatures was very intense and scary. And I had to ask myself all the time, why wouldn't I just go? Like, why wouldn't I just go home? So issue 1, we start out on the island, and then we spend some time with Tess and her family in Chicago, kind of seeing how shitty their lives are there, and that there are people after them and they are in trouble. And then you're right, they don't make it to the island until almost the very end of the book. And that was something that I did as a choice, knowing that it would, some people would be like, oh, but I really wanted to answer that question as a mom. Like, why wouldn't you just leave? Like, or why would you take these kids to this place you've never been. You don't know what's waiting for you there to collect some kind of weird inheritance you don't understand. And I was constantly asking myself, well, what are the circumstances under which I would think this was a good idea? And I had to really back Tess into a corner that way. But I did really love getting to introduce the creatures that we do meet
Yeah.
in this book. And what's fun is probably because I'm a person who's always worked in long form. Once you have read the first issue and you read the second issue, you're going to want to go back to issue 1 because you're going to realize that there's more creatures in the book than you can maybe see on the page. So that was something that Easter eggs are very fun for me.
Oh,
Let's
definitely.
just say that.
And as much as I didn't like the way it ended, just because I wanted more of the story, I mean,
Yeah.
I think it's a great way to end the story because now you have to go by issue 2. Or you want to continue the story, and I think from that point, it's a good idea to keep pushing because there's nothing worse than getting that issue number 1. Everything kind of works out at the end, and it's like, all right, well, maybe a new villain's in the works, and it's like, all right, well, I'm kind of bored now. Maybe I'll just wait, let a couple issues come out, and see if I even want to continue this. So I like there is a nice having stake in the game.
Yeah, well, and I think other than a couple of flashbacks, all 4 of the other issues are set entirely on the island. Like we see a little bit of Tess's life in flashback short scenes like before she had kids, stuff like that. But all the rest of the issues are set on the island on Demond. I think partly I wanted people to care about Tess because Demond is such a great main character in her own right. To have a sentient island where you are completely safe from all harm. Like if you stub your toe and you are one of the chosen humans who gets to live there, like Demond will catch you. Like you will never get hurt. You'll never be threatened. You're not going to get stung by a mosquito. Like you will be completely safe there. But she has a lot of like whims that you will also be subject to. So I think Demond really becomes a main character or maybe even the main character. So I really wanted people to fall for Tess first, and have a chance to sort of get involved in her and her life and the scary stuff that's going on there before we go and deal with the goddess of death and the sentient island she lives on.
Exactly, we're just working our way up. Which
Yeah.
also is impressive in this episode, in this issue, mainly because I was curious, obviously, about you look at the cover and you immediately know we're gonna get kind of a fantasy type of adventure. We're gonna get
Yep.
something mystical. But then it starts off, and we start going to the ball, and we're like, wasn't she the former governor's wife? Why is she in this
Yeah.
job? She has all these kids, one who doesn't really even call her mom. I mean, he calls her by
Right.
first name. So obviously he probably came from the father in out of this marriage. As we find out, especially after we find about going to the island, that some of them are maybe not, kind of welcome there, which was interesting. But you really gave a point of, I guess, caring for the main character right away of, well, why won't her husband answer? Why
Yeah.
why has he abandoned him? Why, how do we get, I think $500,000 in debt?
Yeah.
Uh, how do we get here? And it was more intriguing at the hotel when she gets this inheritance and she hears a name she's never heard, and she tells him, yeah, I changed my name. It's
Yeah.
my dad's side. I don't even want to talk about it, which makes me wonder, well, why? What happened so much that you had to get away?
Mhm. So, it's you are asking great and in-depth questions, which I love. Uh, it's when I was just beginning to write this book, I didn't write down what became the 5 issues. I wrote down pages and pages of world building. I know Tessa's whole childhood, which will never, be in these first 5 issues. It's not important, but coming from fiction, I'm so used to writing the interior lives of these characters, and how they think and what they worry about and what they prefer for breakfast at what time. And I'm a detail person that way, and you don't need those things in comics, but I know them anyway because with writing urban fantasy, I always kind of have this little like story lawyer voice in my head, like trying to poke holes in things. Yeah, but what about this? Why wouldn't she just do this? And so I'm always kind of getting that ready, that that like, no, I need this to be, you know, airtight, at
Yeah.
least as much as I can make it. So giving her Tess is somebody who um never knew her father. I mean, that's obvious in the first issue. Did not know her father at all. Lived on in foster care for a few years before joining the Navy, and then meeting, her husband, who we do get to meet a little bit more through flashback and in the course of the series. So I have Tessa's like whole life in my head, because that's how I would write it as a novel. Is I would have, flashbacks and having her memories come up more. I didn't need it in this, but I can't turn off the part of me that makes the background, you know?
Sure.
So I've got all that like in my brain. I know a couple of comic writers who wrote a comic and then wrote like a novel spin-off or a novel version of it. And I totally get that now, because part of me still wants to write like, here's what happened to Tess before the events of this book down on paper. I actually did get to write a short story that leads into Archaic, the first issue of Archaic, because Ahoy likes to do short stories. So I had a story in an issue of Dead Weights
Okay,
that
yeah.
is about a fisherman that leads right into the opening of Archaic. And that was really fun to do because you can read the story and not go anywhere else with it, or you can read Archaic and not know about the short story. But it was really fun to get to combine both and to get to do my writing thing.
Definitely. And I mean, having done these issues, obviously, and you have an arc in mind of start to finish,
Yeah.
um, building this reputation now with an artist, would it be possible to say you go back and you make a prequel story or something about her father and the origins of the island, and do a prequel, or we do like a side sequel depending on how this ends?
I mean, so one of the things that I'm going to tell you, I do not answer in all 5 issues is why this family?
Yeah.
Or like why this bloodline? Um, but I know the answer. I just don't have it. I couldn't fit it in 5 issues. That's one of the limitations of comics is, you got to stay laser focused. So I would love to write that story, like the story of why it has to be this family and no other family. But otherwise, I think if I was going to write fiction, I would write more about like what the kids are doing as they explore this island for the
Yeah.
first time. So the island is populated by uh, legendary creatures from cultures that are no longer alive as they are. So ancient Mesopotamia, the Incans, there's an ancient Indian group. Like it's cultures that are no longer around as they were. Because the idea is like if you're a god and you're worshipped, and everybody that worships you dies, what happens?
Yeah, where
Like
you go.
where do you go? So it's sort of a retirement community in a weird way. Um, and it's divided into quadrants, and all 5 of these first issues mostly deal with the Mesopotamian uh quadrant of the island. So I would totally write the story of like the 9-year-old twins like going off into one of the different buildings or the Scorpion Village, or wherever, and having their own little adventure while their mom is busy somewhere else. That would be really fun.
Yeah. I mean, the nice thing too is in I think some comic book writers miss out on this, going straight to comic books without kind of working on like the long form prose or doing novels. Is that you could always at the end of this, however many issues you tell, I mean, you could put it in novel form. You could add then all these
Yeah.
ideas you have time for, and you could do spin-off novels where you could do Liam and Audrey,
Yeah.
kids to just literally exploring the island, just archaic, the adventures of Liam and I mean, you have so
Yeah.
much information to do it. I'm assuming that obviously you may not be focused on it right now, but I would assume that's kind of maybe in the back of your head, like, all right, I do have room after kind of the comic books where I could do a graphic novel even.
Yeah. It's something I use to comfort myself because it's very hard to cut like subplots and side stories. For example, on the island, they don't really use cell phones. They have a creature called the mimic dog, which is a teleporting talking dog, but it can only repeat things. And I do think that part of the reason why I use him is because when I was a kid, I had a Petey the parrot toy where you would like it would record whatever you said. So the mimic dog just, when you need to get a message to somebody back at the house, you're like mimic dog, and then it sends the message. So I would love to like I'll be writing a script and I really need to get to, who the killer is and get to this storyline. But in my mind, I'm thinking, what is the day in the life of the mimic dog? Like, what does his day look like? And when is he just like laying on the ground, like angling for belly scratches? And when is he just, oh, it's off to repeat someone else's message again? So I will often just be like, someday I'll write the mimic dog and what he does with his time. It's what I use to comfort myself when I can't do these fun side quest ideas.
Perfect. That's what we call issue 0. Just
Yes, there you go. Issue 0.
all right, ahoy! You heard it. We already have issue 0 ready to go.
Mhm, mhm.
Now, obviously, you put a lot of thought into the story, as we could see in the storytelling itself. Did you originally go into this with kind of world building already kind of pre-done, and you were really just looking at the artwork to kind of finally transform it?
So, what my original pitch meeting with Sarah Litt about this, I sent her, I had a huge PowerPoint already done because I'm kind of extra that way. And like I said, I mean, this whole thing started because I had a story idea that I thought was more visual than most of my others. So, I actually worked up a map of the island using a program called Incarnate that RPG players often use to create like maps of their worlds. And I had worked up and I had dug up all these ancient Mesopotamian bits of mythology and lore and like artist renderings to put in this PowerPoint. And I had figured out like, okay, season 1 is who killed Tessa's father, because you're not supposed to, the one rule on the island is anybody from this bloodline cannot be injured. Like they just can't. She protects them. They are safe there. And yet her father is killed. And so how does that work? Like if you can't even die in an accident really there. So how on earth would he be killed? And so that was my framing device for the first 5 issues. 5 issues, it's got to be who killed Philip. Everything goes back to that. But in my mind, I was like, and if we do more, we're going to this quadrant and we're telling this story. And if we do more after that, we're going over here to this quadrant and we're telling this story. And so I had worlds built out, but it was like being on a first date where you're like, okay, be cool. Be cool. Show that you can be cool. Don't
No,
don't
just a
push too hard. Don't oversell it. Just, be real chill. And so I was actually trying not to go too deep into all the world building and the characters that I had already come up with. I have no idea what Sarah thought. I'm still afraid to ask her. But something in that PowerPoint worked out okay for me.
safe to say she liked the idea.
Yes, yes, I think so. Well, as I look at it now, and it's been like 3, almost 4 years since I wrote up this pitch. I see now how much COVID influenced it. I mean, it's a single mom who is um she's looking for a safe place for her kids. And, this was during lockdown when nothing felt safe. It didn't feel safe to go to the grocery store, it didn't feel safe to have your groceries delivered. Nothing felt safe. And there's a certain amount of single mom wish fulfillment in this book. Like taking your children to a tropical island that like wants you to be happy and will change itself around for you to keep you entertained and enjoying yourself. Like that is such an appealing idea in the winter of 2021. It was like when I look at some of these themes now, I'm like, "Oh yeah, I was not in a good place at all." But I mean that in like a positive way, because the island, the thing about it is all of the humans that live there, the heirs, there's one person who's in charge of taking care of it, and that's Tess. She can't leave. The island won't let her. So it has a certain amount of control over her once she arrives there. As soon as she sets a foot on it, that's the kind of locked in thing that she has is she now belongs to this island. It owns her and it can hurt her if she doesn't return. So there's always something very appealing and also something very scary and dangerous about this island at all times. And a lot of this book is that push pull between, yeah, my children are safe, like they won't be hurt,
Yeah.
but they're also not going to like socialize or make friends or date or, get to experience the world. So there's a lot of COVID stuff in there that I think about now.
No, I think a lot of people we've had on the show, if I ever had the chance to make a documentary or whatnot, the COVID comic documentary,
Oh, that
when
would be cool.
when you look at what happened and how much indie comics especially, I think that was the main step for where we are at with indie comics and a lot of smaller publishers stepping up. I think I think a lot of people relate, especially the artists that are listening and writers. COVID was a huge inspiration or just a way to get out those feelings. And I think a
Yeah.
lot of people benefited from it, at least in the comic industry.
Yeah. I think you can read this without making that connection, but when I read it now, I mean, I'm in a really different place in my life. And I have some more, it's not lockdown anymore. I have a partner. My kids are doing really well, where they were not during COVID. I have two daughters who are both on the autism spectrum, and so COVID was like Zoom school was really difficult for them. It was a tough time. So things are so much better now than they were then, but I'm really proud of this book because it's not bleak and dark. It's sort of fun and wish fulfillment and also, dangerous and exciting. So it's kind of that action adventure thing that I've always loved that I made with my little COVID ideas.
Yeah, no, and again, I think the story shines through for anyone that reads it. One last question before we get the information. You've obviously ripped in a lot of mythology into this. You've taken a lot of inspiration. Is there one mythology or one belief-based creature or goddess, god, that just did not make the book that you really wish you had time to write them in, but it's just so much backstory?
Oh, there are. Well, and my hope is that people really like this book and I get to write more of the creatures on the island. But my biggest issue was I couldn't overpower the residents of the island.
Yeah.
So, Mesopotamian mythology, there are some really cool gods and some really interesting, like powers. But if I put anyone too powerful on the island, it kind of takes away from the island herself because she is sort of a god in her
Yeah.
own right. So Ereshkigal being the goddess of the dead was a nice fit, but there's like lightning gods and storm gods in Mesopotamian mythology that I really liked, and would have liked using. I'm hoping I'll still get to use the flying jaguars because
That sounds awesome.
I looked at some South American mythology that will come up if we get to do more books after these 5, and they love jaguar gods, and a lot of them can fly, and I just think that would be very fun. Even though, and I think Tamina, this is Tamina, she's Tess's bodyguard whenever Tess is on the mainland, which she doesn't get to be very much, but she's a Lamassu, so she has the body of a lion, wings, and always a beard. Which by the way, is one of the examples of me originally not doing a great job of describing something to Sally, because the first drawing Sally sent of the Lamassu, it was a dude's face. And I'm like, no. You got to think the bearded lady. Think the bearded lady as a flying lion monster. I would love to have Lamassu and then the flying jaguars and do like a sky battle someday. That would be amazing. I may actually just bend a plot all around into a pretzel just so I can make that scene.
It's out there. It's going to happen. Well, we look forward to it. So where, obviously, Archaic issue number 1 coming from Ahoy Comics. When is the date?
Wednesday. So it is Wednesday, December 4th, is the first issue. And it is everywhere comics are sold. It is also on Comixology, the Kindle edition, which I've kind of come around on digital comics. I was not a fan at first, but now that I'm getting like old, I enjoy being able to zoom way in on a panel and see like the art in great detail. So it's available in all those places. And I do believe there will be a trade this summer as well.
Awesome. Well, for everyone listening, you can go pick this up Wednesday, wherever your LCS is. If you have Comixology, go to Comixology, read it, let everyone know what you think, pass it on. Melissa, thank you for coming on. Archaic issue 1 is fantastic, and we can't wait to see more. Where can everyone find you if they want to keep up to date with you, what you're doing with Archaic, and what's to come next?
Well, I have a website, melissafolson.com. I'm very into Blue Sky right now. Unlike any other social media platform, I joined Blue Sky when I was a comics writer. With Twitter, I started out in fiction and I started following people on fiction, and also now it's a hellscape. Whereas I signed up for Blue Sky just as I was starting to write comics, and I am having a lot of fun there. So you can find me there too. And I really hope everybody likes this book. It meant a lot to me to get to write it.
Perfect. Well, we are happy to read it. Everyone listening, if you go pick it up, you're going to love it. Archaic issue 1. Thank you for coming on. Everyone listening, we hope you enjoyed watching this or listening wherever you are kind of getting this episode in. Everyone listening, have a good night.